There is something happening around your life that your eyes cannot measure, your emotions cannot explain, and the people around you cannot interrupt. Before you dismiss this moment as another ordinary day, listen carefully, because sometimes God works with the greatest power in complete silence. While you have been searching for signs, He has been creating them. While you have been wondering whether you were forgotten, He has been rearranging what no human hand could ever control. What if the delays that frustrated you were never punishments? What if every closed door, every broken promise, every painful goodbye was not the end of your story, but the careful removal of everything that would have destroyed the future God prepared for you? You have cried when nobody answered. You have carried questions that nobody could satisfy. You have watched others celebrate while you wondered if your own season would ever arrive. Yet hidden beneath the surface of your disappointment, God has been writing a chapter that no enemy can erase. The greatest movements of God often begin where human eyes see nothing. The loudest victories are often prepared in the quietest moments. And today, if your heart is willing to listen, instead of surrendering to despair, you may begin to understand that God is bringing your soulmate in secret, not through confusion, manipulation, or desperation, but through His perfect wisdom that never arrives too early and never arrives too late. You know what betrayal feels like. You know the pain of trusting someone who smiled in your face while secretly damaging your confidence. You know the exhaustion of giving your loyalty only to discover that your kindness became an opportunity for others to use you. There were moments when you questioned your own worth because the people closest to you treated your heart as though it could be replaced. They misunderstood your intentions. They judged your silence. They accused you without knowing your battles. Some abandoned you when you needed them the most, and others watched your suffering without lifting a single hand to help. Those experiences left invisible scars that no one else could see. You learned how to smile while carrying grief. You learned how to encourage others while your own soul quietly searched for hope. You learned how to keep moving even when your heart whispered that it was tired. Yet God saw every hidden tear that never reached another person's attention. He counted every sleepless night. He heard every prayer that dissolved into silence because you no longer had the strength to finish your sentences. When everyone else misunderstood your story, God understood every page. Perhaps you have asked yourself a question that returns again and again. If God knows my heart, why has He allowed me to wait? Waiting is one of the hardest classrooms the human soul will ever enter, because waiting exposes every fear that confidence once concealed. It forces you to face loneliness without pretending it does not exist. It reveals whether your hope depends on circumstances or on God Himself. Waiting removes illusions. It strips away the fantasy that everything valuable arrives quickly. The strongest trees do not grow overnight, and the deepest character is not formed in comfort. God understands something that impatience can never understand. If He answers too soon, you may receive a blessing before your character is ready to protect it. If He removes every obstacle immediately, you may never become the person capable of carrying what you asked Him to provide. Sometimes the delay is not about withholding joy. Sometimes it's about preparing two lives at the same time until the moment is right for both. Think about how often people try to force what only God can establish. They chase attention instead of peace. They pursue appearances instead of character. They mistake temporary excitement for lasting purpose. They confuse emotional intensity with genuine compatibility. But God is never impressed by appearances alone. He sees motives hidden beneath words. He knows whether someone's smile is sincere or carefully rehearsed. He recognizes what no photograph can reveal and what no conversation can fully expose. While people evaluate what is visible, God examines what is eternal. That is why His preparation often happens beyond your awareness. While you wonder why nothing seems to be changing, God may already be removing influences that would have poisoned your future. He may already be exposing deception before it reaches your life. He may already be strengthening another heart to meet yours at the right time instead of the convenient time. Never believe that silence means abandonment. Some of God's greatest works are completed without public announcement. Seeds grow underground long before anyone celebrates a harvest. Rivers carve mountains over time without asking permission from those who stand above them. Dawn never argues with the darkness before it arrives. It simply appears when its appointed hour comes. In the same way, God is never required to explain every step of His plan before He carries it out. Human beings often demand immediate evidence because uncertainty makes them uncomfortable. But faith grows strongest when it learns to trust what cannot yet be seen. If you insist on understanding everything before believing anything, discouragement will become your closest companion. But when you discover that God's silence is not His absence, your heart begins to rest instead of panic. There are people who laughed at your standards because they believed loneliness would eventually force you to compromise. They assumed your patience would collapse under pressure. They expected your values to disappear the moment the waiting became uncomfortable. Perhaps they told you that your expectations were unrealistic. Perhaps they insisted that everyone settles eventually. Perhaps they encouraged you to ignore the quiet warnings inside your heart just to avoid being alone. Yet every time you refused to betray your deepest convictions, you protected something priceless. You were not simply saying no to the wrong people. You were saying yes to the future God was quietly preserving for you. Every compromise avoided became another layer of protection around a blessing you could not yet see. Do not underestimate the danger of counterfeit connections. Not everyone who enters your life is meant to remain there. Some people arrive only to distract you from your purpose. Others come carrying unresolved bitterness that slowly becomes your burden if you refuse to recognize it. Some relationships begin with excitement, but end by draining your confidence, your peace, and your sense of identity. God can see the ending while you are still fascinated by the beginning. He knows which conversations would eventually become manipulation. He knows which promises would eventually become disappointment. He knows which affection would slowly become control. That is why some doors close before you have the chance to walk through them. It feels painful in the moment because you only see the opportunity disappearing. God sees the disaster disappearing with it. You have probably blamed yourself for things that were never your fault. You replay conversations in your mind, wondering if different words could have changed the outcome. You questioned your personality, your appearance, your decisions, and even your value because someone else's rejection echoed louder than God's reassurance. But another person's inability to recognize your worth does not reduce the value God placed within you. A diamond does not become ordinary because someone mistakes it for a stone. Truth remains true even when ignored. Your identity was never supposed to depend on applause, approval, or acceptance from people whose opinions change with circumstances. God formed your value long before anyone else formed their opinion about you. That means your future cannot be determined by the voices that once underestimated you. There is another truth that many people overlook. Before God joins two lives together in a meaningful way, He often begins by healing the places where both hearts still bleed. A wounded heart can mistake rescue for love. A fearful heart can mistake control for security. A lonely heart can mistake attention for commitment. That is why healing matters. God is not interested in giving you a relationship that merely distracts you from your pain. He desires to lead you into a future where your peace is no longer dependent on another person's constant reassurance. When healing begins, desperation loses its grip. Fear loses its authority. You stop chasing what was never meant for you because your confidence is no longer starving for validation. That transformation cannot be rushed, but it is one of the greatest gifts God can give a human soul. There is a reason your spirit has refused to settle, even when your mind tried to convince you that lowering your expectations would make life easier. Deep inside you, there has always been a quiet resistance against accepting what would rob you of peace. There were moments when loneliness whispered, "Take whatever comes." Stop waiting. Stop believing that God is still writing your story. That whisper became louder after every disappointment. It echoed through the nights when memories returned without invitation. It followed you after conversations that left you questioning whether genuine loyalty even existed anymore. It tried to persuade you that your heart was asking for too much. But what if that resistance inside you was never stubbornness? What if it was the wisdom God planted within your soul to protect you from building your future on a foundation that would eventually collapse? The world often praises quick decisions, but God is never hurried. He is not pressured by calendars, by the opinions of others, or by the fear that you are somehow running out of time. His plans are not driven by panic. They are established with perfect knowledge. And perfect knowledge never rushes toward imperfection. The greatest danger is not waiting longer than you expected. The greatest danger is becoming so tired of waiting that you mistake urgency for guidance. Desperation has a way of making unhealthy opportunities appear attractive. It can make empty promises sound convincing. It can make temporary comfort feel like permanent peace. That is why your emotions cannot become your only compass. Emotions are real, but they rise and fall like waves. One day, they fill you with confidence. The next day, they convince you that hope itself is foolish. If you build your future on feelings alone, every storm will change your direction. But when your confidence rests in God, your soul begins to discover a stability that circumstances cannot steal. You stop reacting to every disappointment as though it is the final chapter. Instead, you begin to recognize that God has never lost control, even when life feels completely beyond your understanding. Look back at the seasons that nearly broke you. At the time, they seemed unbearable. You thought the rejection would define your future forever. You believed the betrayal had stolen something that could never be restored. You wondered whether the false accusations spoken against your character would permanently shape people who saw you. Yet here you are. You survived days you once believed you could never endure. You carried burdens that seemed impossible to lift. You stood up after nights when your tears became your only conversation. You learned that strength is not always loud. Sometimes strength is simply choosing not to surrender when every emotion begs you to give up. God did not waste those painful chapters. Every wound became a lesson in discernment. Every disappointment sharpened your ability to recognize what is genuine. Every lonely season taught you to seek your security from God before seeking it from another human being. Many people imagine that God prepares blessings only by changing circumstances. But often He begins by changing hearts. Before He changes what surrounds you, He changes what lives within you. Pride becomes humility, fear becomes courage, bitterness becomes compassion. Impatience slowly becomes trust. These transformations rarely happen all at once. They happen quietly through ordinary days that seem insignificant while they are unfolding. You may think nothing meaningful is happening because your surroundings appear unchanged. Yet the greatest miracle is taking place inside you. The person who once depended on constant approval is beginning to stand without it. The person who once feared abandonment is learning that God's presence is stronger than human absence. The person who once chased acceptance is discovering the peace of being guided instead of being validated. That is not a small change. It is the kind of foundation that can support lasting joy. There are conversations taking place that you know nothing about. There are paths crossing that you cannot yet imagine. There are moments unfolding beyond your sight where God is quietly arranging details that no amount of human effort could ever organize. You are not expected to control every outcome because you were never designed to carry that responsibility. Imagine how exhausting life becomes when you believe everything depends on your own ability to predict the future. Every decision becomes terrifying. Every delay becomes frightening. Every unanswered question becomes another source of anxiety. But when you remember that God sees beyond every horizon you cannot yet reach, your heart begins to breathe again. You realize that your responsibility is not to control tomorrow, but to remain faithful today. Do not compare your journey with someone else's timeline. Comparison has stolen the peace of countless hearts. You see people announcing engagements, celebrating weddings, posting photographs filled with smiles, and for a moment you wonder whether God overlooked your address. But appearances reveal only a fragment of reality. They cannot show the conversations behind closed doors. They cannot reveal the private struggles hidden beneath carefully edited images. They cannot measure the depth of another person's peace or the absence of it. God has never measured your life against another person's schedule. Why should you? A blessing that arrives outside of God's wisdom may impress people for a season, but become a burden later. A blessing that arrives through God's perfect timing might require patience now, but will carry a peace that panic can never produce. The enemy of hope is not always suffering. Sometimes it is distraction. You become so focused on what has not happened that you fail to notice what God is already doing. You overlook the strength you have gained because you are counting what you have not yet received. You forget the wisdom that has grown within you because your attention remains fixed on what still feels absent. Gratitude does not ignore pain. Gratitude simply refuses to let pain become the only voice speaking into your life. When you begin to notice how many dangers God has already carried you through, your confidence for tomorrow quietly begins to grow. The same God who protected you from unseen harm yesterday has not become powerless today. Perhaps you have asked God why your heart had to be broken so many times. The answer may not satisfy every emotion, but consider this possibility. A heart that has never experienced disappointment may never learn discernment. A person who has never been deceived may trust every smiling face without caution. Pain is not something to celebrate, but neither should every painful experience be considered meaningless. God has the ability to transform wounds into wisdom without allowing bitterness to become your identity. He can teach you how to recognize sincerity without becoming suspicious of everyone. He can help you forgive without becoming naive. He can restore your ability to love without requiring you to forget everything you have learned. The person God is preparing for you is not meant to become your replacement for God. That expectation would crush any human being. No one can carry the weight of becoming another person's entire source of hope, peace, identity, and purpose. When people expect another human to fill every empty place within them, disappointment eventually follows, because no created person possesses that kind of perfection. God alone is constant enough to anchor your soul. When your relationship with Him remains your deepest foundation, every other relationship finds its proper place. Love becomes healthier because it is no longer driven by fear of loss. Commitment becomes stronger because it grows from gratitude rather than desperation. Peace becomes deeper because it does not disappear every time circumstances change. Think about the silence surrounding your future right now. It may seem uncomfortable, but silence often protects what noise would destroy. Imagine announcing every unfinished plan before its proper time. Imagine exposing every fragile beginning to people who carry envy instead of encouragement. Not everyone celebrates what God is preparing. Some criticize what they cannot understand. Others attempt to interfere with what they secretly resent. Yet God is fully capable of shielding His plans from voices that seek to weaken your confidence. He does not need public approval to accomplish private miracles. The hidden season is not evidence that nothing is happening. It is often evidence that something too precious to be interrupted is still taking shape beneath the surface. Your greatest mistake would be assuming that because you cannot identify your future, God cannot see it clearly. He already knows the conversations you have not yet had. He already knows the roads you have not yet traveled. He already knows the prayers that will be answered in ways beyond your imagination. Every sunrise reminds you that light can appear after a night that seemed endless. Every changing season reminds you that nothing remains the same forever. In the same way, this chapter of waiting is not your permanent identity. It is simply a passage through which God is refining your heart, strengthening your discernment, and preparing you for a future that does not depend on chance, but on His perfect wisdom. Hold your peace a little longer. Guard your heart a little more carefully. Continue walking with integrity even when no one applauds it. The God who sees what is hidden has never stopped working. And when the time He has appointed arrives, what He has prepared in secret will no longer remain hidden from your life. There are battles that never leave visible bruises, yet they exhaust the soul more than any physical struggle ever could. You have fought those battles. You have smiled in rooms where your heart was breaking. You have answered questions with calm words while carrying storms that no one could hear. There were days when you wondered whether anyone truly understood the weight you were carrying. You watched people make assumptions about your life without knowing the nights you spent wrestling with fear, disappointment, and unanswered questions. Some called you distant when you were simply protecting a heart that had been wounded too many times. Others called you weak because they never witnessed the courage it took for you to keep believing after so many painful endings. But God never confused your silence with weakness. He never mistook your tears for failure. He saw the courage hidden inside every decision to rise again, even when hope felt painfully fragile. He knows the battles you never explained because words could never fully describe them. He knows what betrayal feels like from your side. He knows what it is like to be misunderstood by those who never cared enough to seek the truth. Nothing you endured escaped His attention, and nothing you surrendered for His sake has been forgotten. Sometimes the greatest temptation is not to abandon faith altogether. It is to quietly stop expecting anything beautiful from the future. You continue living, you continue working, you continue speaking the right words, but somewhere deep inside, your expectations become smaller because disappointment taught you to protect yourself from hope. You tell yourself that expecting less will hurt less. You convince yourself that dreaming carefully is safer than dreaming boldly. Yet God did not create your heart to survive on fear disguised as wisdom. He did not call you to build emotional walls so high that even hope cannot climb over them. Wisdom protects the heart, but fear imprisons it. There is a difference between discernment and surrendering to hopelessness. Discernment says, I will wait for what is right. Fear says, nothing good is coming anyway. Discernment keeps the door open for God's timing. Fear quietly locks the door before the blessing even arrives. Do you realize how many times God protected you from conversations you never heard? How many opportunities disappeared because they carried hidden sorrow instead of lasting peace? How many paths were closed because they ended in heartbreak that would have taken years to heal? We often grieve the things we lose because we can only see what was directly in front of us. God sees every consequence connected to every decision. He knows how one choice leads to another, how one compromise invites another, and how one wrong foundation eventually affects every room built upon it. When He closes a door, He is not reacting emotionally. He is acting with complete knowledge. The painful part is that protection rarely feels like protection while it is happening. It often feels like rejection, it feels like delay, it feels like silence. Only later, when the entire picture becomes visible, do we realize that the closed door was one of the greatest demonstrations of God's mercy. There are people who entered your life carrying attractive words but empty intentions. They knew how to create excitement but not stability. They knew how to make promises but not sacrifices. They admired your strengths but had no desire to protect your peace. They wanted the benefits of your loyalty without accepting the responsibility that genuine commitment requires. Looking back now, you can see the warning signs that your emotions once ignored. The conversations that always revolved around appearances. The moments when honesty became uncomfortable because truth threatened the image they wanted to maintain. The subtle disrespect that slowly became easier to excuse. God was speaking through your uneasiness long before circumstances revealed the reality. He was not trying to steal your happiness. He was trying to preserve it. He was teaching you that peace should never be exchanged for temporary excitement. A relationship that constantly demands you to silence your convictions is already asking for too much. Never believe the lie that your season of preparation has no purpose simply because it lacks public recognition. The deepest roots grow where no audience is watching. A builder spends more time strengthening the foundation than decorating the roof, because what cannot be seen determines whether everything else will stand. God works the same way. He strengthens character before increasing responsibility. He develops humility before granting influence. He teaches patience before releasing promises that require maturity to sustain. If He entrusted certain blessings too early, they might become burdens rather than gifts. Imagine receiving what you prayed for while still carrying yesterday's fears, yesterday's bitterness, and yesterday's insecurities. Those unresolved struggles would quietly shape tomorrow's relationships. But God is not merely preparing a moment. He is preparing a future that can endure beyond the excitement of the beginning. The world celebrates chemistry. God values character. The world asks whether someone is exciting. God asks whether someone is trustworthy. The world is impressed by confidence that attracts attention. God looks for integrity that remains steady when no one is watching. There is a vast difference between someone who knows how to impress and someone who knows how to remain faithful. Impressions fade, character remains. Excitement rises and falls with circumstances, but integrity continues when emotions become difficult. That is why you must never measure your future by the intensity of first impressions alone. Some of the brightest flames disappear the fastest. Some of the quietest beginnings become the strongest stories because they are built upon truth instead of illusion. Perhaps the hardest lesson you have learned is that loneliness cannot be healed by simply placing another person beside you. A crowded life can still contain an empty heart. You may sit among many voices and still feel completely unseen. True companionship is not merely about someone's physical presence. It is about peace. It is about safety. It is about knowing that honesty is welcomed instead of punished. It is about finding someone whose presence encourages you to become more faithful, more courageous, and more grateful to God, rather than drawing you toward confusion and constant emotional exhaustion. God does not desire to replace one form of loneliness with another. He desires to lead you into relationships where peace becomes stronger than performance and where trust grows through consistency rather than through manipulation. Have you noticed how God often removes distractions before revealing direction? At first, it feels as though life is becoming smaller. Certain friendships fade. Certain opportunities disappear. Certain habits lose their appeal. You wonder why everything familiar seems to be changing. Yet what feels like loss is often the clearing of unnecessary noise. A traveler carrying too much weight cannot move freely toward the destination ahead. In the same way, the soul cannot fully embrace what God is preparing while refusing to release what no longer belongs in its future. Every unnecessary attachment consumes emotional energy that could have been invested in purpose. God is not emptying your hands because He enjoys watching you struggle. He is creating room for what actually belongs there. Do not become discouraged if others misunderstand your waiting. Some people cannot understand obedience because they have only learned urgency. They assume every delay is failure because they measure life by immediate results. They may pressure you to compromise. They may laugh at your patience. They may insist that principles are outdated and that everyone eventually abandons them. But remember this: crowds have often celebrated decisions that later produced regret. Truth has never depended upon popularity. God's wisdom has never required majority approval. If remaining faithful means standing alone for a season, then stand with confidence. Because one decision made with integrity is worth more than 100 choices driven by fear. Even now, while you cannot see every detail, your story is moving quietly, deliberately, purposefully. God has not paused because your emotions fluctuate. He has not forgotten because your prayers sometimes sound weary. He has not abandoned the promises planted within your heart simply because the road has become longer than expected. Every sunrise declares that darkness has limits. Every season reminds you that change is woven into creation itself. In the same way, your present chapter is not the final page. The waiting is shaping discernment. The silence is strengthening trust. The disappointments are refining your vision, so that when the future God has prepared finally unfolds before you, you will recognize the difference between what merely captures attention and what truly carries His peace. On that day, you will understand that nothing was random, nothing was wasted, and nothing that God guarded in secret was ever forgotten. Every delay had a purpose. Every unanswered question carried hidden wisdom. Every tear watered a future that was growing long before your eyes were able to see it. Now listen with every part of your heart, because this is where many people make the mistake that changes the direction of their lives. They become so focused on wondering when God will act that they stop noticing how He is already transforming them. They stand at the window looking for tomorrow while overlooking the miracle taking place within them today. Yet the greatest evidence that God is preparing something extraordinary is often not that your circumstances have suddenly become easy. It is that your heart has become stronger without becoming harder. You still know how to love after being betrayed. You still know how to forgive after being wounded. You still know how to hope after disappointment tried to convince you that hope was dangerous. That is not weakness. That is the quiet strength that only God can produce. The world teaches people to protect themselves by becoming cold. God teaches His servants to become wiser without losing compassion, stronger without losing tenderness, and more discerning without surrendering their ability to trust Him completely. One day, you will stop asking why certain people walked away, because you will finally understand that not every departure was a loss. Some departures were acts of divine protection. Some goodbyes were answers to prayers you had not yet learned to pray. If every person you wanted had remained in your life, some of them would have delayed your purpose, distracted your focus, and drained the peace that God intended for your future. You cried because someone left, but God saw what would have happened if they had stayed. You mourned an ending that God recognized as a rescue. You called it rejection because you could only see the pain of the moment, while God called it preservation because He could already see the years ahead. There is no wisdom greater than trusting the one who sees the entire journey while you can only see the next step. Never allow bitterness to become the final language of your soul. Bitterness has a quiet way of convincing people that everyone deserves suspicion. It whispers that every promise will eventually be broken and that every act of kindness hides selfish motives. But if bitterness takes root, it begins to imprison the very person who carries it. God did not preserve your heart through every trial so that resentment could become its permanent guardian. He is calling you into freedom. Freedom does not mean pretending the pain never happened. It means refusing to let yesterday's wounds dictate tomorrow's decisions. It means believing that the people who hurt you do not have the authority to define the rest of your life. God alone holds that authority, and His plans are never written by the hands of those who try to harm you. So lift your head again, not because every question has already been answered, but because the one who holds your future has never failed. Walk forward again. Not because every obstacle has disappeared, but because God walks before you where your eyes cannot yet see. Believe again. Not because the world suddenly became trustworthy, but because God has always been faithful. Let hope rise again, not as fragile wishful thinking, but as quiet confidence anchored in the certainty that what God begins, He completes according to His wisdom. Your story is not ending in abandonment. It is not ending in betrayal. It is not ending in loneliness. The silence is temporary. The waiting has purpose. The tears have not been ignored. Every moment of faithfulness has been seen. Every act of obedience has been remembered. Every prayer has reached the one who never overlooks a sincere heart. While others judged your delays, God was preparing your future. While others assumed you had been forgotten, God was arranging what no human effort could accomplish. And when His appointed time arrives, no force can delay it. No accusation can stop it. No disappointment can erase it. And no fear can overcome it. Stand firm, protect your heart, remain faithful, and keep your eyes upon God. Because the author of every perfect season is still writing your story. And what He has been preparing in secret will arrive with a peace so deep, a purpose so clear, and a joy so enduring that every season of waiting will testify that God was faithful from the very beginning to the very end.